Thank you for tuning in to Growing Tech Fast, the condensed Org3D podcast in which conversations about growing tech startups are had with those who have grown them. Today, we have a really special podcast. I'm joined by Wes, who is 2 times talent acquisition at tech startups with a background in agency recruitment. And we're here today to talk all things scaling teams, growing culture, and where you might be going wrong. Wes, thank you so much for joining. What I'd like to start with is a rewind on your career. Tell me all about agency recruitment.
Yeah. Well, thanks first of all for having me, Rosie. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be on today. To give a quick rewind in my career, I started straight out of college, going into a boutique recruiting agency called Proven Recruiting in San Diego. I worked on the permanent search technology side of the house. Did that for 2 years. It was an amazing experience. Starting your career, I think, in recruiting is probably one of the best things that you can do. Even if you go on to do other stuff, you now know how to write a resume, interview for jobs, and negotiate salaries for the rest of your life. So, I loved that, and through a lot of success, but also a lot of failures. Learned a lot about what you should and should not be doing, and frankly, got tired of working with clients who very blatantly were doing it wrong, and who more kind of personally to me, candidates that I would place in these companies that would call me a year down the road and be like, Wes, it's political here. It's a terrible culture. There's micromanagement, all that jazz. And there was nothing at that point that I could really do to help these people who had, placed their trust in me. So I wanted to go in-house. I was able to make that transition pretty successfully to a startup in San Diego called Pet Desk. At the time, a Series A software as a service for veterinary clinics and pet parents. And in the calendar year of 2019, after they raised their Series B, we went from about 40 people to 95 as the only talent acquisition resource within that company. I did not sleep a lot that year.
Pretty much not.
Yeah, it was nuts. But it was so much fun. And again, learned a ton about how to hire efficiently while maintaining effectiveness, and then have been able to take that into my most recent startup at I'm Aware, just as at-home medical testing, being able to grow the team from about 12, 15 people to about 45 most recently in the span of a year, mostly on the technology side of the house, but hiring across the board and really being able to implement a lot of those policies and practices from scratch, iterating as appropriate. And one of the things, especially in startups, that I find such a mismatch for, I mean, the advantage in a startup to your product is your ability to iterate and use market feedback to quickly pivot when needed. And yet it still seems like so many startups are embedded in these really dated recruiting practices and these just like wives' tale type thoughts, right? This kind of weird way of thinking about, like, oh yeah, my favorite question to ask is, what color spaces on a Monopoly board do you like to buy, right? Like things like that, where it's just like, and these are conversations I've had, right? People who think that those are the best ways, or like, what kind of animal would you be, kind of thing, right? When there's just so much more intentionality and deliberateness that companies can take, in recruiting and hiring.
And this is why I'm really excited about today, because I think someone who's worked agency, they've done internal, and you've been on that startup side of recruitment. So where not that personality isn't important in a bigger company, but it plays so much more of a part when you're putting the third, fourth, fifth employee into a company. And on top of that, you did the tech side of things, biggest candidate shortage. Like, your stuff, basically. And I think when you work on the agency side, and what a lot of our network are going to get from this, I mean, the podcast is called Growing Tech Fast. All we do is help companies grow, and they're all tech startups. So a lot of people listening are going to feel some of the pains that you're going to be talking about. Drawing on your experience and some of your methods, you've touched on it a little bit already today, but when we last spoke, one of the things I thought was really interesting was your kind of, every person you add to the team is an individual, and it isn't just a generic, oh, I need to hire a software engineer into team 2 with X years
Yeah.
experience from X company. It's we need someone to fill a gap who would specifically work on this and would have a goal of this in this role. And that is about finding a who rather than a job description. And I want you to, we'll hash it out after, but
Yeah.
give the overview of what is your who and why are you hiring?
Yeah, I mean, I guess before we get into like the process of that and how I've approached that, I do just kind of want to reiterate, yeah, how important culture building is in such a small setting, right? When you only have maybe a dozen or a couple dozen, a few dozen people, one bad hire. I mean, it's one thing if someone just doesn't do their job and that's just kind of, salary that you're just throwing out the window. It's another thing when that person just drags everyone else down with you. And it's not just their personality and everything, but you know, you have to be really deliberate in building your team. Not just from a culture perspective, but based on the needs of the business and what needs to happen there. And so, I never want my hiring managers when they're thinking of opening a role to start just by like bringing me a job description or by looking up an old job description or some other company's job description, right? I don't think that encapsulates the context or the story or the importance of certain maybe technical aspects of the job, whether it be programming languages or just use of certain tools or softwares. And I think you can be as personal to a company as possible when building those job descriptions to reach the right person and have that resonate. And when that happens, you can tell it's pretty magical. The way that I think you actually go about doing that is to start with the scorecard for the position. And I won't take credit for this whole theory. I highly recommend reading Who, the A Method to Hiring by Jeff Smart and Randy Street. I think it's a wonderful template to follow, especially if you are building teams. I will say the book is probably a little bit more specific to executive hiring, but I think you can tweak a lot of the concepts to work for a variety of different positions. The part that I resonated with the most in that book and the process is starting with a scorecard that starts with three primary categories. The first and the most important are desired outcomes, i.e., what is not getting done now that needs to get done in order to justify this position. This is to your point before, right? Like if there is a puzzle piece missing, it is really defining the edges of what that shape of that puzzle piece is going to look like. What I tell candidates all the time in how they should build their resumes and how they should think about quantifying their accomplishments. I think that hiring managers and companies need to think very similarly about it in this desired outcomes and scorecards. Namely, a person is paid for only three reasons at a company. You either make money, or save time. That's it in terms of actual salary. And so when building those desired outcomes, really tying it to those types of quantifiable numbers. If it's a salesperson, that they are going to bring in this much revenue in this much amount of time. For an engineer, it's contributing to a product that can then, bring in, this much percent or whatever of the market base. For product managers, it's making sure that they're or project managers making it more efficient, right, in engineering to be able to complete more story points or whatever per sprint. And there's a way to quantify these things that, again, will save people time. And that basis of focusing on those desired outcomes can inform not just the rest of the scorecard, which I'll get to in a second, but I mean, that informs the larger job description. It informs the 30, 60, 90 onboarding plan, or however you approach onboarding. You can use that for future performance reviews and look at it retrospectively to understand, was this person ultimately a successful hire? Did they achieve these things, or were these goals also just totally off? And this is, again, like a thing that you will continue to iterate on how good you are at defining the shape of that missing puzzle piece. But once you have those defined, and I suggest about 3 to 5 of those desired outcomes, things that you want accomplished in this role within a set amount of time, to then work on role-based competencies. These are the skills or experiences one would need in order for you and the rest of the hiring team to feel confident that they can achieve those desired outcomes. So really those competencies should be informed by whatever those outcomes are. Because if the outcomes are really all focused on making money potentially, right? More of like a sales aspect or something along those lines, then the competencies shouldn't necessarily have anything to do with I don't know, particularly being efficient, right? Or something along like saving other people time, right? If this is going to be like a lone wolf type position, right? So it's really just making sure there is kind of that direct one-to-one causation, right? Like because they have this skill, they can more likely achieve this outcome. They're not just like correlated together, but there's like a real causal relationship between those two categories. And then finally are just those cultural competencies. These are the same for every single position. The 4 key values or whatever that you want to hire for across the board. And those need to be front and center in this scorecard from the very beginning, before you start your job search, before you write the rest of the job description, in order to make sure that you are staying true to those characteristics and to those values that you want to be hiring for across the board, and don't end up making, a hire that, can drag everyone else down with them. So that, I think, like in starting really at the genesis of why any person is hired, right? Starting at that really beginning point of what are they going to bring back to the company in terms of value, and what needs to get done. Why is my life as a hiring manager harder without this person? And that needs to get done in order for us to go, move the needle. That I think is the most important part. From there, I mean, the job description writes itself. If I'm being completely honest, it makes it really easy to tell a story, for a recruiter or your talent acquisition team to provide context, right? It's like, well, there's all this stuff that needs to get done. I can tell it to you, and actually give candidates a really clear picture as to the needs of the organization, what holes there are, what areas for improvement there are, and to be able to put that much thought up front. I mean, it shows itself through the course of an interview process. Candidates notice this because, frankly, most companies don't do this. They don't put in the time to understand, they just are like, oh, the team's a little overworked. Like, let's just hire another person.
Yeah.
Without really like thinking about, well, what skills or what needs to get done for everyone else to not be overworked, right?
Yeah.
Than just getting another body in a chair. It's about answering the actual needs of a team or a business as a whole.
And what, from your experience, when companies don't do this, because I can imagine even when you were in the agency role, you were wanting this level of detail from some of your clients, and not all of them are going to give it to you. What happens when people won't get on board with that?
Again, I think there's like this tendency of just kind of like go, and it really just becomes like ready, fire, aim, instead of like taking a step back to ready, aim, fire. And it's like, taking that one step back to take 2 steps forward. Like, bottom line, candidates notice. Like, if you don't actually know what you want, or you cannot describe the needs on the team and what are the metrics by which I as a candidate am going to be held accountable to, like, what do you want this person to accomplish? One of the more common questions, especially over the past few years, that I myself as a candidate love asking, it's like, yeah, what does a successful hire look like 3, 6, 12 months down the line in this position?
Yeah.
The company can't answer that question. What the hell are you doing? Again, like, they can smell bullshit a mile away.
Yeah.
Right. And so if it's just like, oh, well, like the team's just a little overworked, or, it's a backfill or whatever, that's not really enough to like show really the connection as well between like what this person is doing and how it impacts a larger product or a larger service. This is obviously harder to do in larger companies, but like at any startup, right? Like, one of the big things that any person who seriously, is addicted to startups like I am, I'm going on my 3rd, we'll be starting soon, and other people who have enjoyed that startup life, is because of like the percent impact you can make in the organization as an individual contributor or as a manager, right? Like, much more so than just the sort of cog in the machine at a larger, Google or what have you, right? And so if you as a startup then can't really define, though, like, and sell a story, sell a vision of how this X role and person in this role will be able to impact the organization as a whole, be able to move the needle, you're missing out on one of your biggest competitive advantages in the marketplace. And so, from the agency perspective, when like we did not get this context from companies, it was hard to convince them as just an external recruiter being like, hey, I'm representing company A, they're hiring for this position. And the person would be like, cool, why are they hiring for it? And it's just like, I have no idea. Like that sucks. That's not a good answer to give. And no
Yeah.
one wants to feel like they're just another person being hired, especially again, like when it's a startup. And the point of that is to, again, have a voice at the table, be able to move the needle single-handedly, or really show that you had that contribution on a team that put first to market product out there. That's an advantage that more companies need to take advantage of, especially smaller ones.
Absolutely. And I think I've never done internal. I've always been on the agency side of things, but we're very relationship led, and I have to get all of this information or we walk away, because you can't.
Yeah.
The whole point of using a recruiter, whether you're internal, whether you're external, is to save, as you said, time, money, or resource. And we just can't save time if it's like there's this unwritten rule that you should keep these things a secret, and that you shouldn't tell the person you're potentially paying to help hire, or you shouldn't give somebody who coming into your business as a new hire all of that information pre-roll, so that they can fully understand what will be asked of them and accept that responsibility with full knowledge of what's going to happen. I think it's so enticing to an individual to hear the mission of a role and to hear why they're looking for that. I think often I'll get given a brief on a position, and there's bits in there that tell you what they're looking for, and you ask further questions and you get that, and then you kind of have to make that into a story of what this role is and how it fits into that company's mission. And I mean, like it's as simple as it's just how you're marketing your business. If McDonald's was saying, yeah, it's an average burger, why don't you try it? There'd be a lot less people eating it. But because they've marketed it so well as this thing, as something that is much more than an average burger, um, you get lots of people buying into it. And I think it's the same principle. You have to sell the story. You have to have a story for people to want to get on that mission. And when you join a startup, you're giving up a lot more time than if you worked at a big company, because there is a lot more riding on the results of your work, and you've got to want to do it. So I completely agree. You've got to outline that train that they're getting on. I want to move into, so we understand the who and we understand the why. We know who we're after. We know why we're looking for this individual. How do you? What's your first place you go to find that person?
The first place that I go on to, well, so two, I guess, wings, right, in recruiting, right? You have kind of like passive recruitment methods, which is like the job description, right? Things where candidates will be coming to you. Then there's more kind of proactive recruitment where, you're actively sourcing. So LinkedIn is obviously the primary tool I think most recruiters use. Depends on resources, obviously, in an organization. So, a LinkedIn recruiter license is great. A recruiter light license will still get a lot of the job done. And at my last company, I'm aware the vast majority of those hires that we made over the past year were just on a LinkedIn light license. So it can be done, even with some limited searching capabilities. But I don't want to just like quickly brush over the passive recruitment methods, because I think, I think from an agency perspective, right? Like coming out of the agency world, I never trusted any candidates that were like applying to some jobs.
Really?
I just was like, no, like most people who are applying like maybe aren't even like worth being hiring. And I kind of just like took a lot of that like for granted, and I focused really just on like active sourcing on LinkedIn, and trying to create some tailored messages and sell that story and pull people in. Since going internal, I have seen a whole lot more value of building that sort of employer brand and building a job description that, like we have talked about, tells that story, right? Can give the full context while not laundry listing every single thing that that person is going to be doing, right? Like, one thing that I also want people to take away is that, like, there is a real difference between a job description, which is a piece of marketing material, right? And there's no marketing campaign that just is like 3 scrolls on your computer desktop long. Like, that doesn't exist, right? It needs to be short, sweet, and to the point. It needs to kind of quickly encapsulate what it is that you want. That can inform a larger roles, responsibilities, and expectations document that is maybe more of the laundry list of, yes, quite literally everything that maybe falls under their bucket and purview, but that's not what you should be posting out there. And that's not what is going to get you, I think, a strong passive candidate flow for any job. And I will say that, again, over the past year, despite being in Austin, Texas, in a startup, a relatively competitive market, several of our engineering hires have been people who have applied to us. And I think a lot of that is because, look at the job descriptions that we put out versus some of our other competitors. Ours are half as long, tell a way better story in terms of why this position is open and the impact that it could have. And similar to, again, like, just as when you're looking at a candidate resume and there's not like numbers on there, they don't like show any of like the kind of quantifiable achievements or anything. I think candidates think the same way, right? Like, you should be able to put your goals out there in terms of like, this is what you're going to accomplish, like those desired outcomes, right? Like, these are things that like we're excited for you to get done. And I don't think companies should be scared about like putting that in a job description out there. I've heard a lot of managers and executive level people are like, oh, well, we don't want our competitors to know this. And my general philosophy, and maybe this is coming from a sporting background and like playing American football as much as I did, but like, why the hell not? I want the other team to know my playbook, because we're still going to beat them. Like, that's how I genuinely feel. If you feel so like self-conscious about like maybe like some of your goals in this one job description that now like this other competitor is going to beat you, there's a bigger problem, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's not going to be the reason why you lose. And so I think for all of those reasons, like I think, larger than just kind of the passive recruiting methods and the job description and everything there. I do also, like, I immediately go to LinkedIn. I get my hiring managers to work with me, to message certain candidates. I think it's also be really important to be self-aware at this stage when reaching out to people, because I am the definition of a white middle-class male, right? And I can appreciate why a lot of individuals may not want to immediately respond to me. They may not feel safe doing so or feel connected. And as much as I try to embody that, I need to be aware of my own privileges and the way that I might come across as just, one other recruiter. And so leveraging other people in your company that, may be more diverse than you yourself, is a good way to be able to reach a more diverse, equally diverse, I should say, candidate pool. And so having hiring managers and just sending them like a list of 10 names on LinkedIn or whatever with just like a quick blurb that they can send to those people can help at least get the conversation started in attracting those individuals.
Absolutely. I think it's so interesting that you had that feeling about passive candidate talent. I am a sticker for a good job description, and a good advert, because I think it can make the world of a difference. I tell my team, do everything that can work in the background first.
Yeah.
Like, advert, your current candidate base, get a message out to them all, email or text, however you communicate with them. And all the different options that are passive, and then move to the active stuff, because all of that will work in the background for you, and it's a much more efficient way of working. And some of my best placements have come from applicants, and there is a view that it's easier, or that it wasn't as difficult, but you still spent the same time writing the advert, if not more than you do writing all of those emails.
Oh,
all the
absolutely.
email campaigns.
I wish I learned this lesson earlier. I really do. But I do want to recognize like there is a bias here. I mean, for some of the engineering roles, I mean, we had hired some people who had applied through like Indeed, and yet I know our head of technology had like a real bias for any candidate who came from Indeed. If he saw that in our applicant tracking system, he was just like that they're all garbage. And I'm like, do you know that these three people that we've hired all came from Indeed? He's like, oh no, I had no idea. And I'm like, and he's like, oh, there's
Yeah.
and like, yes, maybe you have to wade through like a higher volume, but it's worth waiting. I would rather spend a lot of time wading through maybe some of the less qualified individuals to find that person who had passively applied, through there, that's a good match, and who showed that interest and level of dedication to want to apply to your company in the first place. Rather than what I see so many hiring managers do, which is just like complain about volume and stuff like that, right? Like, I think there's ways to get high volume, and yes, that comes with
Mm.
its own drawbacks, but I would rather
Hey,
go through that struggle than just not have anyone at all.
if you don't want to wade through tons of job applications, that's why you speak to a recruiter.
There
Like
you go.
they will do it for you. They do it all
Yeah.
day. Um, so one of the things I think is key to recruitment that I think a lot of people overlook, um, and actually it's where as the individual you get your brand, I think, um, is that candidate process. So eh, recruiters have a bad rep, no matter where you are in the world.
Mhm.
People have a bad um, preconception about about recruiters that, in my experience, on the whole, isn't true. But I have heard the stories that would imply it was, and that comes from a bad process and a bad um, organization on their part when it comes to, okay, we've found someone who we think's great. We spent all that time looking for this individual. We found them. We've convinced them to start the process, and then it all falls apart, and it doesn't get all the way through. And I have my thoughts on what makes a good candidate process, but I want to hear yours. Like, given all the experience, agency and internal, what's your take on the candidate process?
Well, I mean, so first of all, I want to emphasize just the level of empathy that everyone, hiring managers and recruiters especially, should have for the candidate experience. And if you are not really aware maybe what candidates go through, then go on to like subreddits and stuff like recruiting help, and like read stories
Yeah,
from candidates who are going through like absolute ringers only to just be completely ghosted. Like, I agree
yeah.
that a lot of the hate that recruiters get is a lot of times unwarranted. At the same time, like, I do genuinely believe that this is for a long time been a little overinflated of an industry, similar to
Hmm.
lawyers. There should not be as many lawyers as there are in the world, but there are. I don't think there
Yeah,
should be as many recruiters as there are. And so because of that, there's going to be, just as there are bad lawyers, there are going to be bad recruiters.
yeah.
And I do think that at this point, they're kind of a dime a dozen, but a good recruiter is absolutely worth their weight in gold.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that comes down to how they view and treat the candidate experience. And I'll say, first of all, this comes down to just some general philosophies, right? Like, just as you would never not respond to like a customer concern or complaint, someone going through your customer support channels or sending a support email, you should never just ignore an applicant. If
Hmm.
someone is rejected, reject them, send them a rejection email, close the loop. Like, it is not difficult to set up certain things, especially automated things in the applicant tracking systems these days, even lightweight ones, where you can set up that level of automation pretty darn easily just by like clicking a couple of buttons once someone applies. And
Yeah.
so I think it starts with just like that commitment to, we're going to get back to every single person. I think getting back to every single person quickly. I mean, there is the old agency saying that at least I was steeped in, which is time kills all deals,
Yeah.
right? And so that
Yeah.
is very true. It's just as true internally as it is externally, where
Hmm.
you need to make like certain commitments and like almost SLAs, right, with like your recruiting team and like candidates. And if you want to like be public about that, maybe take it one step further where you can post that. And I've seen companies do that, which I love. We're just like, we promise that we're going to get back to you within 3 business days. We promise that after every single stage in the interview, we're going to get back to you with an answer within like 3 to 5 business days or something like that, right? And just like set some goals for yourself and your hiring and your recruiting team. And even if you don't have specific like recruiting or talent acquisition resources, these are still goals for like the hiring managers themselves to get back to applicants, to follow up after every single stage, even if that's just a rejection email or trying to set up next stages. And even if there isn't an update because calendars are crazy, you haven't been able to find time or whatever, send someone an email that there isn't an update. Saying that there isn't an update is an update in and of itself, especially when candidates and their livelihoods are on the line. And so having that level of empathy, because I can tell you in my most recent job search, I was refreshing my email multiple times an hour because I just was like, please, like, I want to hear something, right? And if you haven't been in a job search in a long time, you can lose sight of just how invested these individuals are in wanting to go through an interview process and wanting to get hired. So I think it starts with that mindset, frankly. From there, I think like you can be efficient while maintaining effectiveness, right? I don't think that any role other than maybe a few like C-level positions need like 5 to 7 rounds of interviews. I think there are 3 primary steps that just need to be done, right? It's like talk with an initial screener, right? Whether it's like the hiring manager, the HR person, myself as, you know, the internal recruiter or an external recruiter. A conversation with the primary hiring manager is usually the second stage, where it's just like the person who this person is going to be like, who the candidate would be reporting to once they come into the role or working very closely alongside someone who just has more of the technical knowledge in order to really make sure that if there are any sort of technical requirements for that position, that they can be done. And then kind of a final interview with just like other members of the team, right? Other people that this person would work maybe ancillary with or whatever. And I think if you set those interviews up correctly, you time them appropriately, usually like 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and then maybe a couple of hours, a few hours, depending on the role, you will have enough information to be confident about your decision, especially if you're comparing those candidate responses to the scorecard that we created at the beginning of the process. So yeah, I think if you execute those stages properly, and you kind of keep a few other, I think, things in mind, like I don't want it to sound like these are the only things that can happen in an interview process. Like there can be take-home projects, but I think you should have certain rules to them. Like it should not be free work. I think ideally it should be like a problem you've already solved. It should be time boxed. You should not just kind of give someone 12 hours to work on this. I think that that's asking too much. And I think it should never be like a screening stage in and of itself. By that, I mean, if someone does like a project or something for you, a design or engineering challenge, and send it back to you, that should never be a reason to reject someone in and of itself. Like you should schedule an interview, send them the project to bring into the interview, and it should provide content for that interview to talk about. Because I get that that's a challenge, right? Like so much of what I base my interviewing prowess on is, and what I think most people should focus on, instead of asking kind of random questions about, what birth or whatever. The best predictor and indicator for future success is past performance. And so all of my questions and what I tell my hiring teams to focus on through the course of these interviews is on particular examples from someone's experience of both their successes and their failures, because we have all failed. Anyone who says that they haven't or is reticent to talk about it is likely not someone that you want to hire, especially in a startup where you are going to fail constantly and you need to like be able to put it behind you and like move on and go again, onwards and upwards. So yeah, I think, focusing on those specific experiences, right? Like it's hard in some professions maybe to talk about specific designs, or processes or projects. And so giving them something to maybe like do to create that content, to create that example of an experience to talk about in an interview, I think is important. But again, like if you're just going to go through like 5 interviews and there's multiple technical challenges or things like that, the market is going to prove how ineffective that ultimately will be. And you're going to lose out on pretty spectacular people because of it. And
Yeah.
it's avoidable. Like that's the thing. And I get that, especially like for maybe any talent acquisition professionals out there. Trust me, I worked in an organization where like pain needed to be felt in order for change to be made, right? And like that's sometimes to me is the sort of over reliance that especially some startup minded individuals have on data. And trust me, I love data, especially recruiting data. But like there are some pain points that like companies go through in losing out on talent that is so incredibly unnecessary. And maybe I'm in the minority here, but I think like losing one person is too many, right? Like
Yeah.
losing one person because of how your process is set up, without the right level of empathy towards that experience, without the forethought on specifically what needs to be evaluated, right? And like making those projects really specific to the desired outcomes and the role-based competencies. Again, like losing one person because of that is one person too many, especially if they were the right one for your organization.
Yeah, I think it's the most frustrating thing, whether you're the recruiter, whether you're the company, whether you're the candidate, like everybody loses in that situation. You're losing your time as the business. You're putting too much time when
Yeah.
really, unless it's a technical hire, you know pretty quickly whether you want that person into the business or not. And if you're debating it, either you aren't sure if you need to hire or you aren't sure about that person. And if you're not sure, you probably shouldn't hire them. Like, you know, very quickly. Te Technical hires are harder, uh, you, especially if you're an early startup and as co-founders, you're not technical. That's a really tricky one that
Yeah.
I've come across before. But you're so right. Like that person is dedicating 5, 6 hours of their life for free to your interview process. They're so embedded in what you want to do with the company that they're going to give you 6 hours of their time, and you're not even going to see it to a certain extent, or you're not going to give the feedback. It is one of the most frustrating things because I don't think on any side of the party anybody really means for that to happen. It it's the bane of my life a lot of the time. I feel your pain on that. I, it sounds like if you can get a good grip on that when you're in an internal position, you've got the influence to decide what those interview processes are. You can come up with something that that hits the nail on the head more times than it doesn't. I've worked with some companies who turn around processes within 24, 48 hours, and they've never not hit their hiring goals.
Yeah. I
It's
mean,
as simple as that.
I agree. Like it's a choice, right? Like, you can, like, I don't want to minimize what I think a lot of co-founders and executives may feel, right? Like hiring
hmm
someone is a pretty steep investment, and I don't want to like
hmm
make light of that. At the same time, like you are never going to know everything about a candidate. Like it's just not going to happen. Interviewing and recruit, it's speed dating with marriage at the end. You kind of just have to accept that, right?
Yeah,
Like there are going to be mistakes. You know, rectify those mistakes, learn, move forward, hire someone else or something, right? If that ends up happening. But like what's more frustrating is finding the right person in a sea of bland. You found that one like niche person who can really meet your needs. And if you lose out on them because you're trying to understand everything about, from the time they were a child up until their second week in their last job, and how they spent every single waking moment of their time, like, yeah, you're just setting yourself up for failure. And I
yeah,
think it needs to be, a real focus on again, what matters here, right? Like, what are the 3 to 5 main things that really matter? And how can we just evaluate those primary things? And how can you, as a leader, and every startup leader needs to kind of learn this at some point, right? Like, they need to start hiring people to delegate tasks. The founder or whatever can't just do everything all at once. The hiring
yeah,
manager, very similarly, cannot evaluate every single thing. And frankly, they're likely, in all likelihood, not the person best suited to evaluate every single category. There are going to be others on the team who you should
yeah,
divide and conquer and delegate to, where it's just like, you can represent our culture and go over those values. You're great at this technical skill and this design pattern, like focus on that sort of stuff, right? You're someone who is self-taught and continuously grown in their career, right? You can evaluate their ability to like be coached and learn and grow and
Mm,
things like that, right? So I think just being able to understand the resources you currently have to evaluate these different areas, I think is also really particularly important. And being able to do so in kind of a condensed version, right? Like 2-on-1 panels or whatever of like consecutive back-to-back 45-minute interviews or whatever to focus on different areas. That's how I try to set up those interview processes, where things can get better. And I think I know what probably a lot of other like executives and hiring managers and co-founders are going to say to that, where it's just like, well, what if like they what if the first interview shows that they weren't like good enough, but then we already have like 2 or 3 other interviews scheduled right after that? Like that's kind of a waste of the team's time. In my mind, it's only a waste of time if you see it as a waste of time. Most of these engineers or not even just engineers, but most of the people on these hiring teams, I can imagine, aren't hugely experienced in interviewing, especially at a startup that tends to lean a little bit younger and everything, right?
hmm
And so the only way you're going to get better is by practicing. I think giving your team time to practice, even if it turns out that they don't end up hiring the person, means that they're
Yeah,
that much better suited to provide a good interviewing experience the next time, to better evaluate certain things the next time when the right person does come along. And so
absolutely.
it's not a time waste, like it is an investment, right?
Yeah.
Into allowing people to kind of hone their craft in interviewing, which is a very marketable skill. And if you give your
Yes.
team time to do it, they will appreciate you for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's the same for tapping into that passive market. Take the time to do it, and you'll reap the rewards on the other side. So let's say people listening, they have a great process. They really understand who they want to bring onto the team. Um, this person has flown through the interview process. It's gone swimmingly. Everybody on the team loves them, and they really want to get this person in. I think this part of the recruitment process is the one where a lot of companies fail more often than maybe any other part. And this is regardless of whether you're using internal, external, or no one. This part is really difficult, partly because we seem to not like to tell the person who could potentially offer us the job that we really want what we're actually looking for, and vice versa. Company maybe isn't willing to listen to what that is because they think it's not going to be exactly the truth. Um, but getting that offer out and getting it accepted, what's your what's your take on that part of the process? How do you handle it?
I think closing candidates, it starts obviously again at the very beginning. I think so. Like for me, and because of my background in agency recruiting, I think I learned very early. People don't believe what you tell them; they believe what they've already. And so I
Yeah.
think it's really important, first of all, for companies and talent acquisition professionals, founders, hiring managers to really listen to candidates, right? It's like one of those, it's like kind of that saying, right? When like a terrible person like tells you who they are, believe them,
hmm
right? Like when a candidate tells you who they are or what it is that they're looking for, believe them. If you cannot realistically offer what it is that they're looking for because they have 2 children with a third on the way. They're the sole breadwinner, whatever, within the family, and they really just want to be able to spend time with their kids and their family at this point in their life, and they really value work-life balance and remote work. That might not be acceptable to some organizations. That's fine, but if that's the case, then don't waste this person's time.
Yeah.
I think for me, the most important question I ask in an interview process is very early on. I ask about a candidate's priorities, even before I get into the pitch for the role, also because I want to frame my pitch to match their priorities.
Yeah.
But more just to understand, like realistically, what can we and can we not offer? And using that information, spreading it to the rest of the interview team, if the person is a generally good match, right? And we're continuing to move
hmm
forward, that everyone knows what this person's priorities are. that everyone can then predict what questions this candidate is going to ask as it relates to their priorities, and should be ready to speak to them, and should be transparent when things may not be a good match. Now, it's not the rest of the team's time to maybe focus on like the logistics of what isn't a good match. That's like my job
Yeah.
in recruiting and HR. But I do not get, even now going through a recent job search myself, why companies are still so shady talking about salary ranges. I have
Mm-hmm.
no problem, zero problem disclosing a salary range to a candidate, none. Because if we get to that point, awesome. But like, we may not get there unless we talk and make sure that, the way I phrase it is, make sure that we're in the same ballpark and not playing different sports, right? Like,
Yes.
that's
Yes.
really what it's about. It's just making sure that there is some general overlap there. And frankly, if you disclose in the salary range means that they now have a competitive advantage and may like push for like an extra 5K more, to me, that's worth it. The time and money that you spend potentially losing out on that candidate, or it's over 5K, like, absolutely worth it at that point, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
now, if it's a large range and you're hiring from like 100 to 130 or whatever, the candidate is maybe not that senior or mid-level, more associate or whatever. They're looking, I don't know, like 100 to 110, and they're just going to like put their foot down and be like, no, you said the range was higher, so I want higher. Then like walk away from that person, right?
Mm.
Like, knowing, again, just kind of like, just being transparent, I think, like treating these people with like respect, I think is paramount, right? And I don't
Yeah.
understand why companies are still so hesitant to maybe like have those conversations. But I mean, that's just like the logistics side. Again, I think like those priorities is really important. I think telling the rest of the team to be able to answer those questions. And then I think ultimately at the end of the interview process, being able to return to those priorities and saying, you know, while you're still in that final interview over kind of a kind of late wrap up is what I call it, putting those words back in their mouth. You said you were looking for X, Y, and Z verbatim.
Yeah.
And I will try to quote them as much as I can from the notes that I took in that first call. Like, how do
Yeah.
we stack up? Do you have any questions for us as to our ability to meet those standards and to that bar that you have set? And you have now one last chance to either answer any other questions that they have, or just to confirm, yeah, you all absolutely hit those, right? And
Yeah.
having them say that out loud is like one of the biggest like psychological like closers that you can have, as a, you know, hiring manager or recruiting professional. And I think doing that and then kind of coming in with, I think, again, a reasonable offer. If you're going to try to lowball someone, guarantee you like that's going to come around at some point. Like, they're either not going to work as hard if they do accept the offer, or they just simply won't accept it because it's a highly competitive market, you know, still out there. So I think paying people what they're worth,
Yeah.
is keeping them motivated, and then ultimately like just delivering on these things that you tried to sell them on, right? Like, you can't just say that you're a transparent organization and then like during company town halls like refuse to answer some questions, right? Like, that's not okay.
Yeah.
So again, it's just being honest with yourself about who you are as an organization, as a person, as a manager, being able to live up to these expectations that you build. I mean, that's, I think, hugely important.
I think you're right. I think it comes back to the story, doesn't it? Of why they're joining the company, why you need this person, what is the mission that that individual will achieve themselves in the role, but also overall as a company, what are you trying to get at? And then again, starts at the start. I think far too often this question comes too late in the process of what is it that you're looking for? That question has to come at the start. It has to be understood at the start.
Yep.
So that if during the process that person says, hey, this role feels like more of a lead position, or there's a lot more responsibility here than we'd previously talked about, um, that you can tackle those questions and you can take it back to that first part in the conversation. Or perhaps the role has changed slightly, like the who that you need has changed as you get through it and you realize this person has this experience that you weren't expecting to find, but absolutely the team would benefit from, and you can adjust. But you only know that because you've been transparent from the start. When that question comes in at the end of, oh well, this is way more responsibility. I want 20K more. That's when it becomes difficult. And I totally understand the candidate's perspective, what coming from that angle. I think there's a time and place to have and how to have that conversation. But
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with them sometimes that companies change their mind through the process and
Yeah.
you have to adapt, but that will only go well when you've been transparent at the start, you've opened up for questions the whole way through. And then when you get to the end, it's, I'm going to repeat that mission. I'm going to repeat the responsibilities of this role. I'm going to repeat what we can offer you based on what you told us you would like and where we think we fit into your world. Will you accept ours?
Yeah. I'm totally with you. I think like you need to get enough of that context to be able to put that story together and to understand the
Yeah.
why when maybe a salary ask does change, right? And I also like frame that initial question in the screening call as just like, look, like I'm not trying to hold your feet to the fire. Like through the course of this process, you are allowed to change your mind, right?
Yeah.
Like circumstances change. You learn more about the market. You learn more about our needs and your ability to meet those needs, right? Your 110K ask could very well become, 120, 125, and that's fine. You won't know that unless you ask again later in the process, though, right? Like you
Yeah.
should, just
Yeah.
like based on our first conversation, you said you were also looking for X, like in terms of salary amount. Is that still the case, or has anything changed there, right? And just kind of understanding, oh, it has changed. Can you tell us like a little bit more about like why, just get the reasoning, right? Get the why
Yeah.
behind a lot of these things. You've been trying to sell them on the why the whole time. You need to understand their why, not just from salary and another logistics perspective, but in terms of their motivations and what gets them excited, right? And what type of culture they
Mm.
want to be working for, why flexibility in their work life is important to them because of family or whatever other reasons. Maybe they just like
Yeah.
playing pickleball a lot. Best games they get are in the middle of
Yeah.
the day. So they're just going to be signed off from 12 to 2 o'clock, right? Like that's fine if you can facilitate that, but it helps to understand these things, right?
Yeah. Context is so important. Like we had one of these the other day where the candidate wasn't happy with the amount of holiday offered in a role. And admittedly, at first, when you hear that from a candidate, you think, "Oh, come on, we told you about this at the start. Why is it only now?" And actually understanding this individual's reasons for wanting more holiday was that in his last role, he barely had any, and his wife had double, and he missed out on some really big family events because he didn't have enough holiday. So he just wanted to be matched. So it's
I love that.
like
That's
that's such a
yeah.
good reason for wanting a little bit more holiday. So I that context really helps, and it also helps you get to know the candidate a little bit more. I think we have so much more to talk about, and I that
I agree.
we could keep going. And I think there's some things in here which I want to revisit. Like, um, okay, they've accepted the offer. They're not starting for 2 months. How, what do you do? Or they start next week. What do you do? Because I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that you have lots of thoughts around this. But one of the
Having
things,
rebuilt an onboarding process from scratch, yes, I have a lot of thoughts on this.
yeah,
It's
just 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 a handful.
yeah, exactly.
So
So many thoughts.
one of the ways I like to finish off the podcast, but I wanted to give that little, there's something more coming. But to finish this one off,
Yeah,
if the audience only takes one thing from this podcast, what would you like them to take away?
I like them to take away. It's a great question. Um, I mean, I feel like it was just like what we were talking about, right? It's empathy for the candidate experience as people, right?
Hmm.
Like just as like when you as a co-founder or whatever, maybe you're entertaining like a software tool, like a SaaS product or whatever, right? Like you want responsiveness from the company that you're working with, right? To buy
Yeah.
their product, right? You are looking to buy a person's
Mm,
services as an employee. It's a very
yeah.
people think about it differently, but it's not, right? Like
Hmm.
companies sell products and services. People sell their services to another company and their time. And you need to think
Yeah.
of it like that. And they are people. So understanding what their motivations are, trying to move quickly and being respectful of their time and yours in the process. Um, just being transparent, right? Like being transparent, be forward with the salary, right? Be honest with them where it's just like, you said you were looking for X, Y, and Z. I think we have X and Y, but I got to be honest with you. Like, we definitely don't have Z. Is that a deal breaker for you? Right? Like, right. As much as like all of that, like just making people feel heard, making people
Yeah.
feel respected, of their time and their consideration. At the end of the day, like, especially in today's world that is so connected, especially if you're like, especially if you're a direct to consumer product, but even if you're not, like the people you are talking to as candidates could be your customers, right? They could be people that you have to do business with in the future. And you need to treat that relationship with that level of urgency and respect in order to make the positive impressions that can lead to more business. It's more than just like hiring the right person. Even when you don't hire the right person, you still want that person to think good things about your company, whether to buy it or not. Still want them to say good things on the marketplace about you. And they could very well refer someone else, into the job. And so I think if you have that level of empathy and respect for the candidate through the interview process, really trying to put yourself in their shoes, understand their experiences and where they came from, you'll have a good indication and be confident whether or not they're a good match for your company. And I think that you'll be able to go to sleep at night knowing that that person had still a positive experience, even if you didn't hire them, and can kind of go out and do future business for you or add referrals
Yeah.
or simply try to improve your employer brand, right? Like, it's small things that really do add up over time. If you're constantly ghosting candidates, or you're not being transparent, or you're taking your sweet time, like those things catch up with you as well.
Absolutely. Well, Wes, this has been great.
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed this.
I did too.
And I think until next time, we'll thank you so much for coming on. I'm sure this has been really insightful. I will add a couple links into when we release this. So anybody listening, if you want to get any more from this, check out the links. Drop Wes a message if you
Yeah.
want to talk about
Connect on
best recruitment.
LinkedIn and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes. So until next time.